Nostalgic PlayStation title Medieval seems to resurrect itself periodically, remind everyone that actually we loved that weird little game, and then return without fuss to its plot in the nostalgic 90s video game graveyard. But why? What enabled Medieval to get not one, but 2 remakes, and rumours of an animated TV show in the works? Oh, there was also an actual sequel, but it was not that good actually, and for some reason it was designed in such a way that health rejuvenation fountains permanently deplete, and thus health points were almost a finite resource to be managed across the whole game, save for small health vials that you could pick up when replaying levels, meaning if you take too many hits, it might just be easier to delete your game save data and try all over again, and that's only cool when Pathologic does it. But despite the terrible sequel, Sir Daniel Fortescue did rise again in 2019 for a proper fancy remake of the original game. I think the reason why Medieval keeps coming back, and I say this hoping for a 2030 remake, is because it has a rock-solid premise. Medieval is a parody of the medieval, and its visual style clearly reflects and reinforces this. I spent about a decade studying, majoring in English, visual art and history, and I figure I might as well put my degrees to some use to tease out the elements of Medieval that I think keeps it coming back from the dead. Let's start with a rundown of the plot. In 1286, Sorcerer Zarok decided to use his magic to reanimate the dead and lead them as an army against the forces of the King of Gallowmere, a fictional medieval English society. The king's champion, Sir Daniel Fortescue, led the charge against Zarok and his forces for about 10 seconds. He was first slain in the war, which Zarok eventually lost. Somehow Dan was heralded as a hero in the war anyway, and is said to have defeated Zarok himself. None of which is true. 100 years later, the still bitter and somehow still living Zarok attempts to take over Gallowmere once more. Zarok casts a spell possessing the bodies of the living and raising the dead to be his enforcers, and this time, he effectively takes over Gallowmere. The only reason I can think as to why this works the second time round when it didn't in the first place is that in the 100 years that have passed, the number of people who passed on who could be reanimated as his minions increased. He was probably just waiting out a few lifetimes and playing the numbers game. Although, Zarok overlooked the fact that his spell would also raise his old nemesis, Daniel Fortescue, from the dead. Dan gets to work fighting through his hordes of zombies to defeat Zarok and liberate Gallowmere from his necromantic clutches. The player, as Dan, travels Gallowmere, exploring how the quirky and gothic world works and fighting zombies and monsters, but his first task is to escape the graveyard, the door to which has been locked with a special skeleton key held by the Demon of the Mausoleum. One of my favourite moments in Medieval is the confrontation with the stained glass demon that guards the graveyard from upon Cemetery Hill. The demon not only oversees the mausoleum, but haunts it. It is actually encased in, or infused with, the ornate stained glass window of the mausoleum. The subversion here is great. Whereas you usually see religious imagery, for some odd reason a demonic entity is depicted and entombed in this window. There's lore implications here, like, was the demon trapped here? Was this mausoleum built for this demon specifically? We'll never know. Although, unless we do get that television series. Once Dan wakes up this thing, it bursts out from the window, in which I assume it enjoyed a deep, dormant slumber. The glass body of the demon comes from the window itself, which is such a neat idea. The boss makes shimmery sounds since it's made of glass and uses shards to attack Dan. Personally, I think this is the best, most creative boss in the entire game. It's all downhill from here. None of the other bosses have such a cool aesthetic. None of the other bosses have such build-up either as this one does. Like, we anticipate this boss since the second level when a gargoyle tells Dan that this thing has the key to the rest of the world. Maybe the demon is tasked with keeping the dead in, perhaps a policy drafted after Zarok's last world domination attempt. But then something went wrong, because the gargoyle also says that this demon was scheming with Zarok himself. Maybe Zarok offered him better pay or work conditions than the King of Gallowmere, who knows. The grand hill the mausoleum sits on builds tension for the upcoming fight, and this adds a level of frightfulness to the boss that all future bosses lack. Future bosses tend to appear without warning and disappear before even taking a bow. I almost wish this stained glass demon boss was somehow a penultimate fight in the game, but that would throw the pacing and flow of the game overall into chaos. After defeating the stained glass demon, Dan gains access to the town of Gallowmere. You explore enchanted forests, farmland, forgotten ruins, ghost pirate ships, and eventually Zarok's own castle. I don't know why he has his own castle when he tried to take over the world and was outcast, but moving right along. Along the way, Dan must prove his worthiness as a hero and defeat enough enemies to collect a chalice in each level. This chalice takes Dan to the mystical Hall of Heroes, existing on the spiritual plane. His old colleagues are there, as well as legendary warriors from Gallomere's history. They give Dan new weapons and health boosts along his journey if he manages to collect all the things and defeat all the enemies. When Dan arrives at Sorcerer Zarok's castle, we are treated to my favourite line of the game. Using a dark magic called science, Zarok has constructed a device based around the mechanical measurement of time. I love these gargoyles. Then, after traversing a parody of Salvador Dali's surrealist artworks, navigating floating timepieces, trampolines, gear platforms, bladed clock pendulums, and lasers, Dan makes it to Zarok's chambers to confront him in the final battle. Before confronting Zarok, the gargoyle Hive Mind tells Dan that they never thought he'd get that far, undermining his confidence one last time before graciously wishing him good luck in his final battle. The battle begins with Zarok summoning an army of skeletal knights to fight Dan. Dan uses the contents of the chalice to summon his own fighting forces to help him, not something that we were ever told that would happen if we collected the chalice, but we're here now, we're rolling with it. In the arena, Dan can pick up an item called Good Lightning. This item enables Dan to channel his own health points into the warriors that fight for him. The game dispenses with coming up with a narrative and plot reasons for why this works and simply calls the lightning Good Lightning, which I think is hilarious. Zarok has Dan defeat his champion, Lord Cardok, then turns himself into a chicken briefly, then a giant dinosaur-like creature to fight Dan. Provided Dan has enough health left to survive the endgame battle, Dan defeats Zarok, breaks his spells, frees the souls of Gallowmere, and finally, once and for all, becomes the hero he was said to be. He returns to his crypt to resume his long nap, His spirit then, in the good ending at least, ascends to the Hall of Heroes to celebrate his heroism evermore. The gameplay of Medieval is definitely outdated, but it's not entirely unfun. Dan's running speed is quite fast, which matches the fast-paced hack-and-slash combat style. Unfortunately, Dan is weirdly vulnerable to taking damage when within swinging distance of his enemies, and even if you're actively attacking, Dan will still take 2 or 3 hits. This means that players are given the responsibility of making sure Dan keeps his distance from his targets, and with the game's first weapon, the small sword, this can be quite difficult. With Dan being speedy and chaotic, he's also incredibly prone to falling off edges, and while we don't have fall damage yet, falling into water is instant death. Dan moves through the world as if it's a giant slip-and-slide playground, but due to his skeletal status, he's a bit more of a sink-and-walk type rather than a swim type. This means that the few platforming sections shoehorned into the game, presumably due to it being the 90s, can be incredibly frustrating and cause a game over in about 30 seconds. The way that Dan explores the world generally is encouraged to be a sort of trial-and-error process. The game really wants to be an open-world game that gives the player freedom to explore and do quests as they like, but it was a bit too ambitious for its time, and it was certainly no Mizurna Falls. An example, when the levels Enchanted Forest and Scarecrow Fields become available for play simultaneously, it feels like the player gets to choose what's on the agenda. However, you can't actually finish the Enchanted Forest level until you acquire a certain magical item, and to get this item, players are required to complete several other levels. None of this I detailed in my plot summary, but 90s, collect things, unleash demons, battle demons, you know how it goes. So those of us who went to the Enchanted Forest because it sounded cool will be disappointed and frustrated, having wandered around taking damage from unexpectedly dangerous plants and frogs just to discover that they can't make any progress here yet. Medieval beat Telltale to the punch of creating the illusion of choice by a wide margin. In Medieval, the camera is practically its own character. The developers are open about how getting the camera to work right was a challenge since 3D games were so new in the industry, and as a result there are a few growing pains to be felt with the Medieval camera. It's an unpredictable entity. We're supposed to be able to pan it around Dan using the shoulder buttons, but at random, as it so sees fit, the camera will refuse to move, and a little no camera symbol will appear in the corner of the screen. You can get stuck with the camera at a weird angle, and what's even more strange is that sometimes when the no camera icon is displayed on screen, the camera will pan anyway. This makes the little no camera icon out to be a big fibber, but it probably just can't predict what the camera will and won't do in any given situation, and I understand. Working with this camera is like wrangling a cat. All of Medieval's minor frustrations aside, the arsenal of weaponry that can be earned through collecting chalices through the game can be quite rewarding. Dan gets an unexpectedly diverse array of weapons. The more chalices you collect, the more powerful the weapons you receive. The Warhammer is a standout, and this is almost a game-breaking weapon since its charge attack releases an energy burst that can launch small enemies to the moon. You can also receive an axe, several types of longbow, magic spears, an enchanted sword, and lightning. Actual lightning. Be careful with this one though, because you only get a certain amount, and it's the only weapon in the game you can't replenish ammo or enchantment for, though I think it would have been really cool if you could do so by going to the level Pools of the Ancient Dead, where you can see lightning striking in the distance and stand still with a sword and waiting for Dan to get struck by lightning, and then boom! Another 100% of lightning bolts to use to power your acts of violence. But alas, this idea only lives on in my imagination. The game reflects its tongue-in-cheek title, a deliberate misspelling of medieval, in the way it draws on medieval history. What I mean by that is it doesn't really draw on medieval history. Dan's life ended in the year 1286, which in medieval history was when the main crusades were kind of winding down, sort of. 1286 was the year King Alexander III died. One might think that since the king in the game Medieval, King Peregrine, also died in 1286, perhaps Peregrine is a character drawn in parallel to the real-life monarch, but nothing in the text seems to back this idea up. The life and exploits of the two kings don't mirror one another, at all, actually. King Alexander III took to the throne in 1251 following the passing of his father. In 1266 he fought Norway and took, quote-unquote, the Western Isles and the Isles of Man. King Peregrine of Medieval became king when he was 15 years old following the death of his father. He apparently didn't do that much until a famine struck Gallowmere and Peregrine asked his magician to magically resolve it. The magician actually created a dragon chicken, so he was fired immediately, and this opened the position of King Sorcerer to that of Zarok, who fixed the famine somehow and would go on to become the game's antagonist. Despite a numerical coincidence between the two kings, Medieval seems much more interested in making a very loose parody of monarchical goings-on than it does in reflecting on historical events. Yet the text, making the distinction between historical events and the sociocultural processes of history, does actually do some interesting reflecting. Let me explain. In Medieval, Sir Daniel Fortescue died a hero. Except it wasn't Dan, but his captain, Canny Tim, who shot Lord Cardok in the eye at some 1,000 yards. Dan took credit for Canny Tim's heroics despite not really participating in the war between Gallowmere and Zarok's undead forces due to getting shot in the eye immediately. Players learn the truth about Dan as the game opens, with him being scolded by two gargoyles that speak as though they are connected to an all-seeing hive mind. This is the medieval equivalent of getting dragged on Twitter, or Threads, or X, or what have you. The player also gets the opportunity to read the official history books that falsely detail Dan's heroic antics. When I was studying history, there was a big focus on understanding something called historiography, the graphy of historio, if you will. This is the study of how we end up with the narrative that is our account of history. I mean, this thing that happens sometime, common error. That would be a narrative that has been agreed to be truth as far as we know. For that sentence to be considered history, a series of scholars would have to compile evidence in the form of documents like manuscripts, chronicles, literature, journals, books, letters, transcripts, legislation, and archaeological evidence. Then they have to agree on an interpretation of that evidence. Usually academics argue amongst themselves about their interpretations, and we have to average out their different perspectives and call information that is most widely agreed upon the facts. It's quite a process. And that's just the thing. History is not an object, it is not a concrete narrative, it is a process. Something that can cause issues in this process is that quite often the way old documents were written can be confusing. Not only do we have to translate these documents from ancient languages, but then we get to argue over whose translation makes more sense. Since history happened in the past, those who study it are required to a certain degree to imagine what things were like in the past. We can look very closely at the evidence, but since we weren't there, we're always trying to fill in the blanks as most reasonably as we can. And everyone does that a little bit differently, similar to how two people can read the same book and know its plot twist but have completely different interpretations of what it meant. When looking at ancient historical texts, particularly ones that have several translations floating around out there, we argue over things like what makes sense to say and write in the cultural context of the time that these documents were written. And considering that no academic has lived through ancient times to modernity, we're forced to guesstimate how people were back then and what they meant by certain words and phrases. What we do know is that the culture has changed a lot. Changed as in, imagine trying to explain the language we regularly see on TikTok now to someone from 2001. But how does this figure into medieval? It's part of the joke. Medieval parodies the contentions we have across medieval historiography. History is misrepresented in the game and places its protagonist, Dan, and the player along with him on a journey of redemption. Dan must become a true hero to make up for the mishistoricization, that's a tough word, of Dan and prove himself worthy of entering the Hall of Heroes, a kind of spirit reward world for well-known political and military figures, where they stay, I presume, until summoned by Amargus to compete for the chalice. Probably shouldn't do that joke. As much as we imagine medieval history as deep lore with accepted facts that require memorization, there's also kind of a lot more navel-gazing than you'd expect in historical studies. Now, all this is not to say that history is unknowable, but this all is to say that history is not a list of facts, but instead a process of reading a continuum of sociocultural and political phenomena. This is why it's important to think about whose stories of the past we listen to, and that we make sure to listen to lots of different voices, and keep a keen ear out for the voices of people who have been systematically silenced. Listening can be a powerful political act. As weird as it is to transition from that back to Medieval, I have to do it. Medieval shows us how the details of a scenario can be swapped around and misattributed. Let's note that the queer-coded Kenny Tim, who appears to have an affection for Dan, was erased from history and his heroics misattributed to Dan. While the truth doesn't really come out by the end of the game, Dan does make an effort to become a hero genuinely and serve the community that believed him to be their hero. While making this effort, various characters have these little jabs at Dan that continually undermine the assumption of his status as a hero in life. The traditional male-centric knight hero figure becomes the source of humour, which dismantles the assumption of centrality, credibility, and authority that Dan was societally positioned to wield without really earning it. The game is punching up at the traditionally powerful knight character and underlining the assumptions that put the knight archetype on its pedestal as suspect and potentially a complete fallacy. Of course, unfortunately, the game still is a product of its times. No critical analysis is complete without a careful look at the missteps of the work in question. In the Hall of Heroes, Dan meets an African warrior woman who unfortunately is represented terribly. Her accent is offensively exaggerated and she is hypersexualized, both through the visual design of the proportions of her body and by the way she interacts with Dan. For some inexplicable reason, she is infatuated with Dan and verbally expresses this excessively. There are only 2 women in the entirety of the Hall of Heroes, which is already problematic, representing heroism as a field of work with some serious gender issues, but out of only 2 women in the Hall, one of them fawns over Dan. The fact that one of only 2 female heroes, and the one who is not white, is represented as over-sexualized and fawning over Dan's notably British, read as white, knight, is incredibly uncomfortable and problematic. Another problem with Medieval is that the text links Zarok's villainy with gender non-conformity. The game includes texts that make fun of Zarok for wearing a dress. I'm pretty sure he's wearing sorcerer's robes, but if Zarok wanted to wear a dress, then we know better now than to contort this into a put-down, because there would be nothing wrong with Zarok wearing a dress. It's literally just a bit of fabric. Secondly, the game does a bit of a problematic by implying Zarok has inappropriate interests in animals. In one line of his dialogue, as he's transforming himself into different things to find something he thinks he can defeat Dan in, it's a bit of not good, really. Zarok was villainous enough for raising the dead, possessing the living, and trying to take over Gallowmere. The game just didn't need to roll out the misogynistic, queerphobic, and weird comments. Unfortunately, the 90s was kind of rife with this style of content. When going back to these older titles, I know that there's a higher risk of hearing these sorts of harmful lines, and I think there is a utility in pointing them out, acknowledging them as harmful, and in doing so, stopping them from perpetuating a sinister cycle of normalizing talking about people this way. The developers of Medieval have been pretty open about what inspired them to make the game. It was a time of experimentation, where game devs were working out how 3D animation and level design worked. They exercise their creativity in this new dimension of the medium of video games. They carefully mention being inspired by Tim Burton films, all but saying that they were inspired by the 1993 Nightmare Before Christmas. You can see the visual styles of Medieval reflecting the aesthetics of that film with the kooky gothic comic style. The developers of Medieval stated that they were inspired by German Expressionism when designing the game. German Expressionism was an art movement that arose out of the post-World War I period in Germany. Star Figura states that in the 1920s, the inflationary period brought about many mediocre printmakers. I said that wrong. The inflationary period brought many mediocre printmakers into the booming market, many of them encouraged by smaller, short-lived publishers who wanted into the trend. And they took a formulaic approach to the expressionist vocabulary of distortion, simplification, and angularity. The movement was multimodal, encompassing different mediums such as graphic mediums as well as printmaking, sculpting, etching, and film. Figura states that the movement arose out of a feeling of dissatisfaction with the existing order and a desire to effect a revolutionary change. The attitude, rejecting bourgeois social values and the stale traditions of state-sponsored art academies, was perhaps best reflected in Paul Klee's 1903 etching Virgin in the Tree, a grotesque parody of the King convention of idealized or allegorical female nudes. This work shows a distorted body and a similarly distorted tree. The lumps and dips in the body and the tree reflect one another. You might expect to see soft, flowing organic lines in the artistic depiction of a body and a tree, but the style subverts this expectation, making the soft and organic into the rigid and contorted. We can see a similar approach reflected in the art design of Medieval. Trees become angular, and faces like Zarok's become just as harsh as the bark of those trees. Works of German Expressionism exhibit a dark appraisal of reality. These works often feature thick lines, jagged or rigid representations, heavy mark-making. Figura notes artists such as Munch, Kandinsky being influenced by German Expressionism. Star Figura states that in the 1920s, I've already said that quote. I'm going to have to do so much editing on this audio. Tillot recognises the hallmark features of German Expressionism as grotesque and caricatured figures of paintings, sinister shadows and unbalanced images of the films, and reoccurring themes of madness, duplicity, and alienation. In Medieval, most of these hallmarks are accounted for, if albeit in an entirely unserious way. The world of Gallimier is designed as a grotesque caricature of our world. We see architecture bending at impossible angles and zigzagging roads. We see the playable character as an awkward distortion of a skeletal figure, and his armour as an exaggerated representation of a knight's suit. Dan leans to one side as he stands. His skull is asymmetrical and his legs and feet are always somewhere between a flop and a jerk as he moves. Dan's design and movement accentuates an awkward and permanent imbalance. The plot of the game nods to madness, duplicity, and alienation in the mishistoricization of Dan's heroics. Did I say that right? Mishistoricization, yeah. The plot of the game nods to madness, duplicity, and alienation in the mishistoricization of Dan's heroics, the mad science and necromancy conducted by Zarok, and Dan's social difficulties as being rejected by the other heroes and the gargoyles of the world. Yet, Medieval stops short of engaging with these themes in any way beyond making a joke out of the traditional character trope of the knight in shining armour. Medieval's textures look as if they've been thickly outlined. In example, the tiled floor textures and textures that include extruding bricks. The artist chose a side of the brick to heavily outline in black, indicating the object depicted in the texture has a drop shadow. The draw distance hugs the corners and edges of the environment. The environment is revealed as though the darkness recedes in response to Dan running through the world. This is quite visually reminiscent of the chiaroscuro effect, or in other words, the stark contrast between light and dark seen in German Expressionism, and most prominently in Baroque art. Also, I am not sure if I am pronouncing chiaroscuro correctly, and I can't really remember the way my professor used to say it. It was 2015, a lifetime and possibly an entire alternate universe ago. Darkness is also present in the silhouettes used in the distant skyboxes. In example, the graveyard level uses dark silhouettes of buildings to imply that a town encircles the graveyard itself. In the level, the Pumpkin Serpent, the way the camera follows Dan through the level has the silhouettes of the skybox and the draw distance overlaid atop one another, making the presence of darkness much thicker, more oppressive, and creating great contrast to the vibrant greens and oranges of the attacking flora in the level. Some of the ways that the world is distorted really stands out visually in the game, such as the extreme hill in the graveyard and the zigzagging of its perimeter fence. The way that the hilltop mausoleum curves its way into the sky, creating coffins out of its doors and windows. We should note also the presence of a set of teeth above the door of the hilltop mausoleum, implying that you don't so much visit this building, but rather get eaten by it. Another element of German Expressionism was that the distortions of the world represented in these artworks are meant to express the feelings of the people living within and seeing this world. The distortion represents how it feels to be there, to move through the space. I would argue this concept is at work in the logic behind putting teeth above the mausoleum door. This installs foreboding and danger into the passage into the mausoleum, which I think further builds the tension for the upcoming fight with the stained glass demon, which once again is the high point of the game. It's the best, you might as well stop playing after that point. No, okay, that's a bit harsh. Finish the game. In the design of the characters and their world, we see the blurring of the angularity of German Expressionism and the visual conventions of the comic. The stylizations of the comic come from necessity, which is an ethos of production that is appropriate to the technological limits of the PlayStation. The PlayStation could not produce fine detail in a three-dimensional world. Pre-rendered backgrounds enabled games like Resident Evil to show detail and impressive graphics, and Silent Hill attempted to show detail in a 3D world by drastically limiting the draw distance. But Medieval took a comic approach to its visual style to address the technological limitations of the hardware. Comics traditionally being produced quickly approached representing people and their worlds in simple terms. We see the human figure reduced to simple shapes such as circles and rectangles. Environments become simple, lacking in detail to ease the process of production. The distortion of form in notable German expressionism is confronted by the reductions of form commonly seen in the comic representations. Medieval presents a distorted world to maximize the capability of the PlayStation and minimize the visual drawbacks of the PlayStation, just like a comic would do. This method of simplification doesn't necessarily work unanimously across the different level concepts the game includes, though. An example in the level The Lake, otherwise known as the town of Mellowmead, is so dark that the level opens with a path that trails into absolute darkness. The wide open space around this path is obscured by the pitch black draw distance, and for the most part the architecture of the level is too far in the distance to make out what this place is at all. There are so many shadows in this level that honestly this darkness obscures the purpose of the design. We just don't get enough visual information to understand where on earth Dan is headed. The remake improves on this flaw considerably by actually putting things in the level and making them visible. The pitch darkness of the original does make it intimidating though. It forces players to walk into the unknown, without even cueing us into what kind of environment this is. This level follows this up by engaging us in some off-the-wall logic, because there's this weird organic surveillance system where a giant eye will trigger an unknown frog dinosaur thing to attack Dan. Then Dan must find a giant whirlpool in the middle of the lake, freeze it, slide down the frozen whirlpool, travel along a frozen tunnel through the lake, and pass by a giant swimming butterfly elephant to complete the level. I cannot further explain what I just described. At least I can say that there's definitely a lot of creativity within Medieval. Medieval keeps getting remade because it's crystal clear on its premise, doesn't take itself seriously, and frankly, those of us who remember the original are quite dearly fond of those memories. But nostalgia alone couldn't get this game remade twice. One cash grab nostalgia trip remake would be feasible, but the follow-up remake in 2019 evidences the fact that people tend to actually enjoy this game, flaws and all. There are some solid ideas behind this. The game draws together its influences with humour and lightheartedness. The game weaves its artistic influences together well, and in such a way that the German expressionism and cartoon visual conventions complement one another. Dan is a recognisably cartoon gothic protagonist. The subversion and subtle critique of the conventional knight protagonist complements the satirical presentation of history, which highlights the instability of historical narratives. The specific blend of influences and concepts enables Medieval to periodically arise from the past and step back into the pop culture current, make its point, and then step away again for a while. I can only hope that in a potential future remake we might be able to improve on some of the source material. Well, that's about it from me. This has been A Loading Screen, and I, your host Kiva, have been seriously overthinking Medieval. Thanks for watching.